now. And now we have Margot Hodson, who wears several hats. The first one is that she is the vicar of a parish of 4 churches in Oxfordshire. She also teaches environmental ethics at Oxford Brook University. She is one of the directors of the John Ray Initiative, which is an educational charity that aims to bring together Christian and scientific understandings of the environment. And last but not least, she's on the board of Arosha UK, which is a Christian environmental and nature conservative movement, of which I think both of which organisations our course director Hilary Marlowe is also involved in. So you can ask both of them about this. She's published several books, 3 of which we have here. First one is Cherishing the Earth. It's on the bookstall that she co-wrote with her husband, How to Care for God's Creation. Another one that she co-edited, The Place for Environmental Theology, a guide for seminaries, colleges and universities that might be of interest to some of you. And also a short book, Grove booklet, Uncovering Isaiah's Environmental Ethics, so the book of the Old Testament. So all 3 of those are available on the bookstall, and we look forward to what you have to say to us today.
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to be back at Faraday and lovely to be back at Cambridge. And that's partly because the work I'm going to bring to you this afternoon actually started in Cambridge 3 years ago. And I was at the annual conference for the Society of the Study of Christian Ethics, and it had that year the focus on climate change, and I was actually speaking on the ethics of climate scepticism. And I met up with a very good friend from Arosha, a lady called Ruth Valerio. And we had, those sort of college dinners. You sort of sit next, and after a couple of glasses of wine, it all begins to sort of come out. And we had a kind of honesty session on hope. Because we often both were asked to be conference speakers on environmental issues. And what tended to happen was that you had the sort of scientist coming on who would talk all about the environmental problems, climate change, biodiversity loss, all these different things. And then we were kind of wheeled on as the sort of theologians, and what we were expected to do was to bring hope. And that was where we're expected to sort of engage. Now, the only problem was that our hope began to wear a bit thin. I feel I came on with this kind of bright smile, don't worry, we've got hope. And it didn't seem to really engage. At the beginning of the 21st century, 12, 13 years ago, we had both felt that there was considerable proximate hope, present hope, that our current environmental problems could be resolved. And that was especially true of climate change. The science for it was absolutely overwhelming. The IPCC were, absolutely united that we needed to do something about it, and it seems that that was bound to happen. In 2002, I was at a John Ray Initiative conference in Oxford on climate change, and we brought over a whole pile of Christian leaders, policymakers from the States, and we really had this feeling that things would go forward. But the problem has been that as this century has worn on, and as the last decade has worn on, it's become very clear that we're facing huge environmental problems. And the more that the century progresses, if you like, year by year, the more dreadful things become uncovered. Those of you watching the news in the last month would have seen the Indonesian fires. Those burning of forests has been going on for decades, but has reached critical levels. And you see more and more things impacting. And it's clear that these can't easily be resolved. There's an American activist, Bill McKibben, who I know has spoken here, has published a book which he's called Earth, spelt with a double A, because he says we can't any longer see this planet as planet Earth as we've always known it. Things have fundamentally changed because of human impact on the environment. And unless we engage with that fundamentally change, unless we see it as something different, we're not going to be able to respond to it in any intelligent way. So, for Ruth and myself, as the environmental situation deteriorated, so our hope, we realised, and we both admitted to each other at this Cambridge dinner, had shifted. We'd moved from that proximate hope that we can make those changes, we can make the differences. You know, Kyoto Accord at the beginning of the century thought would be coming in. It would be the first of many steps to solve the problems. As we've realised that that proximate hope wasn't actually happening, so we'd kind of flipped to the other end of things, to an eschatological hope that you might say, don't worry, it will all be all right in the end. Actually, in some theologies, people really do believe that. Don't worry about what we do to this planet, because it will all be all right in the end. We certainly weren't thinking that, but we were looking more and more to that future hope and seeing that as the solution to our present hope. But as it was, sort of flipping from one to the other, we felt it lacked reality, and we were struggling to find an authentic hope for this age. We're both quite involved in an organisation called Transition, which is a secular organisation that works to bring together, to make community resilience in the face of both climate change and increasing resource depletion. And we both found that our secular friends with concern for environment, the sort of hope we were thinking didn't seem to offer them very much. So Ruth and I kept in touch, and a year later we set up a small gathering of senior scientists, theologians and activists. And we discovered that our struggle for a genuine hope was actually shared by the majority of people who came to this conference, and the majority of thinkers, many others wrote in who couldn't come and sent in some ideas. And so together we began to feel our way to a more resilient hope. And that 26-hour sort of gathering that we had of just a small group of people, Sir John Horton was there, we had John Bimson, who I know spoken this week, there, Dave Bookless was there. And we began to feel our way to a much more resilient hope that could sustain us in this contemporary situation. And what I'm going to give you is just a little bit of what we've been discovering that's going to be published later this year on a free web resource, and I'll give you details of that later. And we've been working on this hope very much from a Christian context, having had this small conference. Then last year we held a much bigger communicators conference and advertised that to people such as Tier Fund staff workers, Russia staff workers, diocesan environmental officers, many others who were trying to bring those environmental issues into a faith context. And then on from that we went to a further stage of looking at the majority world and working with some theologians there to see what we could learn from them in this sort of search for hope. So, what have we discovered? Well, obviously we discovered the importance of that future hope. It isn't clearly just up high in the sky. It is something very, very much more solid than that. And from both the Christian, in fact, and a Jewish context, there's the idea that heaven and earth will be renewed. In fact, in most religions, there's this looking to some utopia, some renewed heaven and earth at the end of the age. And that there will be harmony restored between God, humans, and nature. And, of course, Revelations 21:22, those of you who know the New Testament might well be familiar with those, and Isaiah 65, both give a vision of that future a sort of redeemed world. Very interestingly, and it was the focus of my work on Isaiah, it's not a sort of wilderness utopia. It's actually quite domestic, it's quite farmed. If you look at Revelation, you will see that what you find there in those last chapters, which talked about Jerusalem coming from heaven to earth, that's very much Tom Wright's work, if you've read any of him, that heaven is coming to earth, not us going to heaven. Then out of the New Jerusalem flows this river of life that feeds the leaves of that feeds the trees of life, and the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. So from, if you like, the human realm comes this redemptive living water, and then from the natural or the non-human nature comes these healing leaves that then heals the nations of humanity. But a very much a urbanized sort of impacted ecology, not a sort of natural, untouched by humanity. And again, in Isaiah, you can also see that. In Isaiah 65, it says, you know, you've got the vision of the future in Isaiah. Everyone will sit under their own fig tree. They'll be able to plant their own vineyard. They'll look at their own flocks. And Isaiah 11, which speaks of the sort of future peace of the Messianic kingdom, so strongly thought about in Judaism, has the wolf lying with the lamb and the child playing with the cobra, almost as if those wild animals are now tamed and part of society. And it's a lovely picture of a future peaceable kingdom. It's a lovely picture of peace and harmony restored, of the restoration of humanity with the rest of the natural world, humanity with each other and humanity with God. But I suppose the question that we need to ask is really, what does it mean now? How does that impact on where we are now? Because if we're just looking to that distant vision, it doesn't actually have, you know, what practical impact can it take for us now? And as we progressed with looking at the Hope Project, we began to see a taxonomy of hope emerging. It's very clear that future hope sustains our present hope. And Richard Borkham, who's now based in Cambridge, was very helpful in giving a paper on this. And he took the classic text of 1 Corinthians 13. It's one I very frequently have for weddings, and it ends with the words that these things remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. And he explained how these related. He explained that love is the greatest of the three because it's two-way. Biblically, people in preaching might say that God has faith in us or God hopes for us. But actually, that's not a biblical concept. But God certainly loves us. And if you look back to the beginning of Genesis, where God creates day by day and says it is good, in saying that, he is saying his commitment to that creation he's made. He's expressing a love for that creation that he's made, and that culminates in Christ when it says God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. So that love is a two-way virtue, but that love actually is the means by which our present hope is sustained by the future hope, because it is through love that that hope is strengthened and made sure. So it's clear that the future hope sustains us in the present. But our present hope needs to be realistic. And I think it needs to be something that can be communicated in a universal way. Each religion will have their own particular interpretation, but it will be communicated beyond those boundaries. Is there something that can sustain us as an Earth community? We need something that we can all share together to be a hope that will keep us going. And I think present hope, proximate hope, has several subdivisions. First of all, there's optimistic hope. And that encourages us to work to solve those challenges that we have to face. That's the sort of hope, if you like, that we started out with 10 years ago when we were thinking we could solve some of these problems. And we need to keep that hope as well. One of the people I think who's been strongest in keeping his optimistic hope has been the climate scientist Sir John Horton. And he's always maintained that we have the resources to meet the challenges of climate change, and that the global community, if they could simply get together, will do so. And he's enormously optimistic that that can happen. And he's been a huge inspiration in the face of people who've challenged that optimistic outlook. He's kept going through many difficulties to say we have got the resources to do it within our society, and that humanity has got the common sense to eventually put those brakes on and begin to address the issues properly. But secondly, there's what I've defined as pessimistic hopelessness. This position is felt by those who simply see that the environmental problems are too big to be surmounted by humanity and basically give up. And that it leads towards a very fatalistic response. It tends to lead towards inaction in the face of impending difficulty. And there are two groups that particularly fall into this category. We found that teenagers very often are very, very pessimistic. And I think it's as they reach the age when they can grasp the level of human problems, they see they've been generated by all the generations ahead of them. They see themselves entering into this world that has been so badly damaged, and they have no control over the world into which they've been placed, if you like. And their response is one of deep pessimism and depression. And that is something that really needs to be turned around, I think, with young people when it comes. But the second group, surprisingly, is conservation biologists. And in 2010, a paper was published in Bioscience that was called The Culture of Conservation Biologists, Show Me Hope! Exclamation mark. And the authors, who were Swazeygood and Shepherd, said, "We contend that there is a continuing culture of hopelessness amongst conservation biologists. They fear that the continuing stream of bad news that comes from their discipline actually may put off young scientists from thinking of joining them. And it might also skew recruitment towards actually recruiting fairly pessimistic scientists to be conservation biologists." And that was the sort of thing that they were putting out, that maybe the kind of public persona of people involved in that profession was such a pessimistic one that you'd have to be pretty pessimistic to join it. Moreover, they felt that depressing news about conservation topics could have such a bad effect on the general public that they could think, well, nothing can be done. Why should we bother? And they challenged conservation scientists to balance the realism that they're putting out with hope. And they suggest that at conference presentations, publications should not only have all the bad news, but maybe have suggestions to how you could counteract some of the gloomy data that they're producing. Perhaps they're optimistic. I see some smiles out there. Perhaps they're optimistic scientists, but that was how they were thinking. Because if you trek down that pessimistic route, you're actually not going to be able to do very much to turn the whole situation around. The people, of course, who are trying most strongly to change the situation, to do something about the situation very often, are the green campaigners. And one of the people who've been involved in the Hope Project has been Andy Atkins, who's head of Friends of the Earth, and he gave a paper at our second conference. And he felt that the way you need to do effective campaigning is to sort of get into that psychology. You need to move people somehow from pessimism into a more optimistic outlook. You need to give them hope. And if all of the data out there is very negative, you need to have a means as a campaigner to somehow shift people from focusing on the negative data and getting heavily depressed to actually looking for something positive and feeling a sense of optimism and hope. Well, if you've been looking at the news over the last 24 hours, you'll discover that for 16 hours yesterday in central London, the tallest building in the city, the Shard, had a group of 6 women climbing up it. They managed to get through the security and they went up this, what looks to me like a completely glass building. It made me feel quite funny even to think about it. But anyway, it's 310 metres high, or 87 stories. And these women climbed this particular building, and they were members of Greenpeace, and their campaign was to try they in the end leapt down a big flag that was against the drilling in Alaska, and they actually had a much bigger sort of installation that it took them longer than they thought to climb the building, and so they weren't actually able to get their other bit down, I think, before they were arrested. But that sort of stunt, we might think, why on earth do something as daft as climb a building about that? But if you're trying to move people from pessimism to optimism, if you've got, if you like, heroines like that inspire you, that sort of lift your spirits, you think, wow, you know, what amazing people to have done something like that. It's something that shifts you from feeling that you're in a very pessimistic world to feeling that you're a group of people galvanised to really do something about society. And those sorts of stunts are aimed to make that shift and to make people who are feeling on board with those campaigns much more positive about, and have a very positive feeling about their community and who's representing them. So pessimistic hopelessness is something that is very negative and needs to be turned around. There are several other negative hopes as well. There's something I've called bright hopelessness, which is a bit like hedonism. That you see the problems, you think you can't do anything about it, you know, the planet is going down the tubes, so don't worry, eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That's actually biblical, it comes from Isaiah 22. And increasing numbers of people respond to our environmental crisis in that way, of course with very, very dangerous consequences. And I think when we look at our world in the West and we see the way we're living, many of us are living in that way almost by default. And it's something we need to think perhaps very carefully about. And then another form of negative hope is false hope, the category of people who deny the problems and they try and continue to promote an optimistic hope without promoting the need to move or to change to get there. And they don't fully address the very serious situation we face. Some environmental skeptics take that approach. But I also think the concept of continued economic growth actually is part of that false hope. There is no way with a finite planet that we can have infinite growth. And yet that is so deep in the culture of Western nation states, Western society, that is always being put out as a justification for doing things that are taking us further and further, if you like, down the road to destruction. So is there a satisfactory way forward? Well, one of the key African environmental scholars is Archbishop Thabo Makgoba. He's Archbishop of Southern Africa, and he's also head of the Anglican Communion Environmental Network. He's also one of the very senior, he is one of the very senior African archbishops. He actually, in the last month, was the one who went to see Mandela. So I think he's somebody who is a very strong voice coming from the South. He speaks about the South African experience when, following the end of apartheid, there was an expectation of utopian change that could not be met. And he seeks to reveal a hope based on redemption that is tangibly grounded in reality. And he describes the focus on the environment in one of his dioceses, the Diocese of Niassa in northern Mozambique, where they've been exploring the principles of umoja. Umoja is a Swahili word that means to have a common mind, and it's an enculturated form of appreciative inquiry. And they take the idea of seeking to jointly share the mind of Christ. And this has led to having a very much more holistic faith in the way they've approached things. It's resulted in community building, and it's resulted in a deepening of faith. Part of their focus has been on food security in a country that has ongoing issues with food scarcity because of environmental problems. He also gives another lovely example in Lesotho, where baptism and confirmation candidates are asked to plant a tree when they're baptised or confirmed as a visible witness to their commitment to the earth that God has created. And as these trees sort of begin to grow, and there are more and more of them, so it becomes more and more visible of the community of faith. But also in a country where deforestation has been a major problem, it becomes a real sense of the community's commitment to the environment. And these practical examples, I think, demonstrate a further category of hope, which is a very much deeper and more resilient form of hope, which we've come to describe as robust hope. And it's something that's profoundly biblical, and perhaps best summarised in the words of Romans 5, in that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And there's a relationship between this form of hope and, I think, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's idea of costly grace. Now, Bonhoeffer described costly grace as the incarnation of God. If you know John chapter 1, that whole idea of the incarnation of God coming into this world, and he who was the agent of creation becoming a created being. And the robust hope is based on a firm understanding on that incarnation of Christ. Christ who loved the cosmos so much that he came to live among us, suffer, die, and rise again. The embodiment of God creating the world and saying, this is good. And this leads to an understanding of the risen Christ. The Christ in John 20, who, again, as we heard in the last talk, didn't rise as a kind of Platonistic spirit, but as a real physical being. And in doing so, again, affirmed this world, affirmed the material world, affirmed the earth that God made. And there's a lovely image of Christ in the garden that you find in John 20, and there's a lovely painting with him with a hoe, and of Mary coming to him and recognising him. And it's almost like Jesus the new Adam, and there's Mary the new Eve, and there's Jesus with his hoe, being the gardener, doing what humanity was asked to do in the beginning, which was to serve and to keep this world, to look after this world. And it's a lovely image that you find in John 1. And that leads on to the idea of Christ as the risen Christ, then holding creation together. And in Colossians we find that Christ was the agent of creation and that he sustains creation and holds it together, which are hard concepts to grasp, but I like to think of it as the kind of energy that led to the resurrection must have been, just phenomenal. I mean, it must have just led sort of nuclear energy standing. And if you think of that energy of resurrection, of redemption, then being built into the very fabric of our creation, as Christ holds creation together, you could get the feeling of the sense of Christ bringing in that future kingdom as the resurrected Christ. And many of those themes are also picked up in other faith traditions. And so Christ holds creation and waits for its liberation. And creation has been groaning, waiting for the liberation of from God, as we hear in Paul's book to the Romans. Robust hope has, if you like, a firm understanding of that ultimate hope, where heaven and earth will be renewed and restored, but where we're looking towards that in the present age. And robust hope makes that ultimate hope visible here and now in real and tangible ways in the present. It's the hope of perseverance. The more severe our present reality becomes, in fact, the more that robust hope is made visible. So it's not as if this hope disappears as things get more difficult, but this hope becomes more visible. And in a letter to a friend from prison in 1944, Bonhoeffer wrote that far from removing people from the world, costly grace sends the Christian disciple back into the world to follow Christ there and demonstrate his love, because that's the only way that we learn to have faith. Now, these thoughts have recently been picked up by Jürgen Moltmann, who's also written on hope. He's written a book on the ethics of hope very recently. Many decades ago, he wrote on the theology of hope, and this is picked up in a more ethical dimension in his recent publication. And he cites Bonhoeffer and Blumhardt as the only pietistic German theologians who have a firm theology of the earth, because both understand the kingdom of God as the kingdom of the resurrection of the earth, and they've brought the realism of godliness and faithfulness to the earth into Protestant theology. And Moltmann has followed these themes into his own theology of hope, and it's one that's fundamentally engaged with the world. It focuses on what we are to do instead of what we are not to do. So for our own response to the Christian message, the focus is not on, if you like, a personal faith that's trying to kind of be freed of our sin, of our guilt, and to live by avoiding doing wrong, but is quite is looking at things the opposite way round, to consciously choose life, to choose a way of living that maximises the world's potential. And so it's talking about actions that are impelled by hope, that are not in the mode of ought, but are in the mode of can. And an action sustained by hope is a free action. It's not done under compulsion. It's a principle of conduct that is governed by the gospel, not prescribed by the law. And we see that in our hopes we have. Those of you with children or grandchildren, you have hopes that is a free thing, that you hope of them, that you will lead you to give to them, to nurture them, to see that future for them. Costly grace is the foundation and the source of robust hope. In our discipleship, we are called back into the world to suffer, to persevere, to gain character, and to discover hope. Because we're called to engage with this world. It means we're called to engage with it in every way, with the land, with society, with ecology, with the problems that it faces, and with our own particular calling and responsibility. And in doing so, we make Christian hope visible in this world. And to give some examples, I've been experiencing just being involved in a local community in all sorts of different ways. We see that hope made visible in our community. One of our local primary schools this morning had a special assembly to open their Eco Lodge, which is a special classroom they got some funding for. And this is a way in which they're teaching children to value nature, to see that as something that is a priority in their lives. And it's been very encouraging to see these children take on those principles and see them made visible. In our wider context with our transition group, we've seen in many just small practical ways how we've been able to make visible a hope that there is a new and a better world that can be won through a sustained and a robust hope. So, living out our care for the earth isn't simply something that we do as part of our kind of, if you like, good citizenship. I believe it's actually part of Christian discipleship, and it's a theological act. And that's something I think that is picked up in the Anglican 5 marks of mission, where mission isn't simply seen as, if you like, explaining the Christian faith and educating people in the Christian faith, or simply as giving service and help to those in need, or simply giving justice to others, but is also seen in caring for the environment. Because unless we see our faith in that holistic way, and I think as an earth community, unless we see from all number of faiths, and indeed those with no faiths, us working together with a robust hope that can meet these challenges, we won't see a way forward, and we won't see a way through to something that is stronger and better. And through the Hope Project, we found that this has been our shared experience as scientists, as environmental activists, as theologians, and as church leaders. Now, I was guest editor for the journal that's going to come out with some of these papers, and I took a week off work to edit it, as you do when you're working full-time as a pastor, and you don't have much time during a working week. And so I sort of spent a week sort of deep into Moltmann and Bonhoeffer and all these other things. And I came back into the parish and I had to do an infants assembly. And I looked up the theme that I was supposed to teach on, and it was hope. So immediately I ran, my brain went off to all these sort of very conceptual things. And I thought, what do you say to 5 and 6-year-olds? And very often, what you say to children is the key to what you really think and what can actually be something you can understand yourself. And I took this verse from Hebrews, and I slightly paraphrased it. I said, we have a hope as an anchor to the soul Or hope is our anchor that keeps us safe and steady. I think that's what I said. God's hope is an anchor that keeps us safe and steady. And I think that embodies Borkham's idea of the relationship between love and hope. Because if you like, that robust hope is the anchor, but then the love of Christ, of God, is the anchorage. And if our hope is properly anchored, and our hope is anchored in God's love in that future world that we're looking to, so it will keep us strong in this world. And I feel drawing on some of those mid-20th century theologies of people who knew huge suffering, like Bonhoeffer, but in very different contexts to the environmental context that we now have. So I think we can draw on that and find some ideas of things that will sustain us in our world today. So the project that I was working on is going to be written up in, it's coming out in the autumn, in the theology journal Anvil that went online about 3 years ago and has just moved, is in the process of moving websites. It's going to be the first one on a new website, so I can't give you the address of that. But that's coming out in the autumn, and we'll have some of these papers in it. It's a free resource, and there will also be paper editions available. Now, I can't talk about hope without also mentioning Jonathan Moo and Bob White's book on hope that has come out this year as well, which brings further insights into this whole issue. And I think what we've realised is that in looking at hope, we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more there. There's so much more that can be mined and quarried. And I think we'll see a number of other publications coming out on this theme in the next few years as we seek to find that hope that will sustain us through to the future. So thank you very much.
So, do we have any questions? And Gary is going to have right down at the front to start off with. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. Really appreciated, really loved what you said. I was wondering if you could give sort of practical suggestions for what it means to care for the land when you live in an urban environment. I mean, I know that, obviously unplugging things and being careful about electricity use, but there's also that ends up being just negative. Becomes just don't do this. What are the positive options?
Yeah, just a tiny anecdote. There's a rabbi in Israel called Eilon Schwartz who despairs of going to New York, and he goes into a synagogue and they say, we've been doing a project on the environment and they've built themselves a rainforest or something like that. Completely ignored New York where they're living, and they're looking at environment as sort of somewhere else. And he says that it's not that we must leave nature, learn how to leave nature untouched, but we must learn how to touch nature. And I think that's the rub of it. And in terms of doing some positive things, our transition group, in fact, showed a film around the local community that was called The Age of Stupid, that raised a lot of awareness, and it also raised a lot of money. And we bought an apple press with our money, and we used that to press apples from people's gardens. And so in a suburban context, that's a way in which you can do something very positive, because I mean I've seen people with bin bags full of apples because they've just let them fall and thrown them out. In a more urban context, if you're right in the middle of the city, in terms of the positive things you can do, there are quite a lot of those negatives, if you like, of turn things off, but there's also those positives of insulate your house, and you'll find that your bills go down very significantly. If you have a roof, you can put some solar on them, and that can be, produce some very positive results. We often talk to students, and we're aware that they don't have roofs and they don't have other things. Another way is to look for local foods, and they're usually, even in the middle of cities now, there are local food markets and farmers markets. And that can be a very positive way. And even local wines, which we even have in England. So that can be extremely positive in doing something. So there are those. Gather your friends and have an evening together and cook together and enjoy each other's company, and then you only heat one house and not a whole pile. So that's a positive way to save energy in the winter. So there are a lot of small things. Sometimes using a bike is not the best way in cities. I do know people who cycle through London. I don't think I would, but that's another way to do it. Walk places, go overland rather than underground, and that has to be positive. So those are some of the ways, if that helps.
Any more? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I just had it was almost a recommendation. I don't know if you've seen the New Economic Foundation. You mentioned the false hope of economic growth. There's a fantastic cartoon that's only a minute and a half long, and it's called theimpossiblehamster.org, and it's just this hamster that just grows and grows and grows.
Right.
And it's just it's just a fantastic visual of what we expect to happen not being possible.
Yeah, and that's very helpful, thank you. And the New Economics Foundation has made an enormous contribution in this area to puncture that bubble that economic growth is just limitless. Thank you.
Sorry, if I could just follow up on that. I was about to make the point. It seems to me that one of the biggest problems we face is economic expediency. I know that coming from a country where a government is obsessed with economic expediency, and there's dismantling effectively the Resource Management Act, opening up conservation land to mining.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that there's a whole area out there where you just can't batter in on it, because the answer is always, well, yes, but it's, economically that would be lovely, but we can't afford to do it, and the whole issue of externalities and everything else like that doesn't get taken into account.
And really, that's a very kind of 1960s approach, wasn't it? When we used to kind of bulldoze beautiful Elizabethan houses to kind of widen the road in the middle of a town to say, well, we need it for cars. And it's strange that that's still there, particularly for energy uses. I mean, currently in this country, fracking is one of those ones when we're getting a lot of these shale gases out, which is going to do enormous damage. Might give us 10 years of gas, but that's all. And you'd think, well, actually putting the investment into renewables would be a far better use of those funds.
The whole issue seems to be, but it makes jobs, and we desperately need jobs. And that in itself is supposedly unarguable. But
and I think all of those are that kind of unrealistic hope that it doesn't really look to the realities of the situation that we're in. So thank you.
So I might just add to follow on from what you've just said, the point that the gentleman just made. I think it's because governments have a short lifespan in the Western world, and the rewards that would be reaped in the eyes of the electorate from producing jobs are a lot quicker and a lot more felt in the polls than would be any long-term gain. So I don't know, maybe this should be a dictatorship, and that's the way to save the planet.
Yes, thank you. That is an enormous problem. Is democracy for all? We want it and love it, and how important it is because it's in 4 to 5 year terms. Has enormous shortcomings when it comes to dealing with very long-term issues. And I think one of the things that can help on that are those who are in long-term situations, particularly landowners, others who might have a longer-term view of things. Rather than elected situations, which we would find in the British House of Lords, for example, where there are many scientists who are able to with the electoral system. It's interesting that Obama, in this second term, which is his final term, has kind of gone all out, or that he can't be re-elected, so he might as well go through. But that's been very positive, that he has been saying some very positive things.
Oh, and
You can go ahead there if you prefer first.
This is just a comment on that. The flip side is that we, the electorate, have an enormous power, and I think we neglect to use it. Because the one thing that politicians care about is getting re-elected. And if we say this is a really important issue, I'm not going to vote for you unless you do something about it, they will do things about it. And that's been shown in the past in things that the public care about. So, you know, I think we're being lazy if we don't use that power, because that's the one power people died for to get us. And it is a very powerful power, actually, and it does work. So I just encourage people to use that. And actually, I'd also encourage people of faith to use those links, because we have reasons for doing things which are not economic and are not out of self-interest in the way that much of the world works. And that also has an enormous power. Many of us have connections with mission or aid agencies that are overseas, so we actually see at first hand the effects of climate change on the poor and the disadvantaged. And that's we have an incredibly powerful constituency. You know, there's Christians in every patch of Britain. And I think we'll be culpable if we don't use that power, actually, to be honest. Those to whom much have been given, much will be required. And that is the power we have. So I just encourage people, you know, to be more proactive. Because we do have a Western democracy and they do have to get re-elected. So let's make the most of that.
Yes, our most active Green local councillor, who's a member of our transition group in my village, when our MP came to visit and he introduced himself to him, said, and gave his name and his address, because he'd sent so many letters into the MP that he actually knew who he was and where he lived. And he shook his hand, he said, because you're great, because you write in on a variety of issues, and you know, he's very positive about this person, and I'd encourage you to write to your MPs. It really does make a difference. They do notice it.
Thanks very much for your talk. Between bright hopefulness and false hope, I think there's a form of, I like your comment of I think most of us fall into the category of be merry for tomorrow we die. I think there's a category of sort of blind hope. I've thought about this a bit in relation to myself, and if I exegete myself as an economic consumer, we all put the responsibility on, well, governments need to be re-elected and governments make choices and decisions, but most of us don't want to reduce our own consumption. And whilst we all say that the world can see that, as you say, the world is not capable of supporting our current level of consumption, you know, if I look at myself, my car has a much bigger engine than it needs because I enjoy driving a faster vehicle. The size of footprint of land that I live on is bigger than everybody else on the planet. I don't give it up. So I think we can, before saying we need to start with governments, before saying we need to elect other people, it's our own personal will to make changes. It starts there.
No, thank you. That's a very, very important point. And certainly that brings greater integrity to what you do.
I just wanted to say that I agree with that, but I also think it's very, very important that we do lobby our politicians and that we do actually take concrete action sort of in the political arena, because some scientists actually are saying that we're very soon going to be reaching the tipping point where it's too late to do anything about climate change. In fact, we might have already reached that point. The situation is very urgent and extremely worrying, and I think we all need to take action on an individual level, and governments need to become more concerted in terms of organising people to actually take action, because I don't think we can just rely on the goodwill of people to do things individually themselves. I think governments actually need to take the lead, and we need to push our governments to do so.
I think that's very true, and certainly Bill McKibben, who's from Vermont, and Vermont, I think it was Hurricane Irene. Sort of, it didn't do too badly in New York, but it kind of wiped Vermont, and whole farms, whole areas were totally destroyed. And he talked about localism and the fact that, you know, we have these ideals and it's very important to do them. But actually, if you don't do the campaigning and if you don't do something that's going to actually make governments change, then we won't actually stop some of these major forces happening. I think I'd defer to Bob on whether we've reached the tipping point or not. I think looking at government forecasts now, we certainly are committed to a much warmer world than we would like by the middle end of this century. I think that's the case.
Some things we have and some things we haven't. So.
Yeah.
But there's issues about nitrogen use and other things
Yeah.
quite far from time.
Yeah, which is another very big area.
You know, we've used two-thirds of the arable land in the world.
Yeah.
Burning it up.
Yeah, there's huge issues in all sorts of areas. It isn't just climate change.
Yes, and the ways of promoting this in the local situation and church situation. I wonder, for instance, how many churches, we don't want too many committees, I know, but how many churches have a committee for justice and peace?
Yeah.
And this is one way of getting, as a congregation, to be more involved.
Yeah.
And just one further example of what can be done that way, it goes back years ago, and I can't remember what the issue was, when one enthusiastic minister so exhorted his congregation that 40 of them actually wrote to their MP. And the result was that the MP came and they had a special meeting in which
Right.
they talked through the issue.
Fantastic. That's really worthwhile.
Since I'm a philosopher, I should be the fly in the ointment. I teach environmental ethics in South Africa. And perhaps environmentalism and environmental ethics is a little harder in the developing world. I volunteer also in an NGO that does peace building work, and it also sees the development of peace as environmental peace and developing good relationships with the environment and so on. We had the example of going to Newcastle, which is not upon Tyne, it's in KwaZulu-Natal. It's a very underdeveloped and fairly poor area. Many mines that were there have closed down, and many of the children, young adults, have no hope. The HIV/AIDS rate is increasing rapidly. And when we asked teenagers about sexual behavior, for instance, the response was, well, we have no possibility of ever finding jobs. What difference does it make? And now here's the leap. When people have that very attitude even to themselves, it's quite alien to start speaking about how you shouldn't litter or you shouldn't recycle.
Yeah.
So my experience then of teaching environmental ethics is it becomes something very alien,
Yes.
very, very foreign, and so far from the experience, despite the fact that in Africa we can speak about all kinds of notions of Ubuntu and whatever else, and seeing God in all of creation and so on. These are very idealistic and abstract concepts from the lived reality that's harsh.
Yes.
And you know, it's great to plant trees and so on, but hope really is something lacking in the experience of so many.
So it is that deep pessimistic fatalism that
Yeah.
they have come to.
It's very sad to see that in young people
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
just don't care.
Yeah.
Well, if I get AIDS,
Yeah.
what difference does it make? And unfortunately, something like ecology or these sorts of messages become totally foreign in a kind of desolate and barren experience. I don't know what the answer is.
No. And our experience in speaking in schools in the UK has been that it is young people who can be the most, very pessimistic. And even here, where they do have, everything compared to where they'd have in some of those townships. And it's how can we bring something that is a more robust hope that they will feel they can engage with. Whether it's some of that thinking that Andy Atkins brought of things that will shift people into a more optimistic view. But it's not easy in those situations, that's a very helpful contribution. Thank you.
Hilary.
I wonder if I could just interject with an example also from Africa that is not the answer to that problem, but is an example of how you can possibly work with communities to offer that sort of hope that is more than just an idealism. I've been involved for a long while with a Christian conservation charity called Arosha, and they have one of their projects in Kenya. They faced the problem that the local tropical forest was being chopped down by villagers because they wanted to sell the wood for school fees for their children. And of course, no one would deny that education is the path out of poverty. Secondary education is not free, and so the villagers had an understandable desire for that, and were therefore cutting down the forest. And the charity Arosha worked with them and with a lot of the tourists, quite a high tourist area, to set up an eco-bursary scheme whereby the tourists that come in contribute what in Western terms is a very small amount, $1, $2 or whatever for their stay, that goes into the bursary fund that villagers can apply for their children to have secondary education. And they also worked on training some of the younger people as forest guides and train them in the sort of biodiversity and so on. And so you have a situation where the villagers now are passionate about protecting their forest because it provides education for their children and jobs for their young people. And I think there are examples of that, of what I call win-win situations that provide hope. They're examples of hope. It's just we need more of them.
And I think we need development projects and environment projects that work together like that have a balance between them, because they're certainly not in conflict with each other. They do work together with each other. Yes, thank you.
And presumably the conservation farming movement is a similar sort of
I think, yeah.
initiative.
Yeah, I think so. It's having that sort of holistic view that takes things forward. And I mean, classically, again, 10 years ago, so there was a sense of, were environmental agencies people with very different aims to development agencies, and there was a sense, was there a tension between them? But actually, unless they work together, you don't have anything that is practical and works. And that's very important to look to in many areas. Yes?
So if I might add to that, I think there's an issue as well, though, there are people who will work against their own best interests. As an example of that, we had locally a suggestion for the establishment of a marine reserve. Now, in an area where there's a lot of recreational fishing, the local fishermen were absolutely aghast and fought, and the whole thing just died. And that was despite the evidence that where you have marine reserves, marine biologists demonstrate that the fishing actually improves just outside the marine reserve. So, here's people working against their own long-term best interests, and it's somehow or other, it's very difficult to get through to them. It's everything gets dismissed, and unfortunately, it's in an area where greenie is a pejorative term, and I think that is a fundamental it is greenie. To be greenie is to be a tree hugger and what have you, and I think it's a very difficult thing to overcome.
Strap a scuba kit on them and show them what trawlers do to the seabed. I think it is one way to fight the marine reserve thing. It is just appalling what trawlers digging up the seabed so that the fish no longer breed.
Yeah, but at the same time, the government's encouraging finfish farming, which has appalling consequences.
Yes, I'm right here.
I think there is a need for conversion, and the conversion has to start with us, with our own behaviours. And I would like to think that as church communities we can take a lead in our wider communities. Example where we live, and not just where we live, food banks are a fantastic communal success, started with the churches and now moving out, and where we live in Malvern, there are now collection points at all the supermarkets, and people are extremely generous. But the thing is, we have to reach out to them rather than expecting them to come to us. We go to where they are and speak to them in the language they understand, and then we can achieve something. But we have to start with ourselves and with our own behaviours and with our own church communities, really.
And I think there's evidence that when people are grappling with extreme poverty, as we heard in South Africa, actually then it's very, very difficult to engage with environmental issues, because survival is the key thing. And even if what you're doing today is damaging the environment for tomorrow, you will still tend to do it if it means survival today. And so it's actually tackling poverty is a key means for doing something in environmental areas. So thank you very much.
Any more? Yes, just at the back.
Just a point on this narrative of poverty, as coming from Romania, which in the past and to some extent even now, it is a developing country. I think poverty is not necessarily opposing, to some extent, environmental destruction. I think within poverty, and there's a lot of great examples of communities that, being impoverished from an economical point of view, manage to have a friendly or somehow a natural relation with the environment around them. I remember my parents from the most mundane examples of having the bags that right now are so popular in the West, the recycling bags way back in the 80s, or the recycling milk bottles, or many, many other examples. I think poverty makes you more resourceful or inventive. And in that way, you tend to have a sense of respect towards the environment that you might not get when you have everything available to you.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yes, if there are no more questions, I think we might have a break before the next lecture. Yes.